Michael had spent over 2 decades of his life sitting in an office, watching the years blur together in a monotony of deadlines, emails, and an endless cycle of routine. The American dream, the one he had worked tirelessly for, had turned out to be nothing more than a treadmill, constant movement, no real progress. He wasn't poor, but he wasn't rich either. He had a decent salary, a comfortable apartment, and a car that wasn't flashy, but got the job done. Yet every morning when he stared at himself in the mirror, he felt empty. The idea of leaving had started as a whisper in the back of his mind, something distant, almost laughable. Move to another country? Start over at his age? But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He was single with no real ties holding him down, no wife, no kids, just a handful of colleagues who would forget him a week after he left. The thought of retiring in a place where his money would stretch further, where life moved at a slower, more meaningful pace, was intoxicating. He found himself diving into research late at night, scrolling through expat forums, watching YouTube videos of foreigners who had made the move. Thailand, Vietnam, Colombia, all tempting options. But the Philippines kept appearing in his search results. The stories were always the same. A low cost of living, friendly people, a tropical paradise, and of course the allure of meeting someone special. Michael wasn't naive. He had heard the warnings, read about the scams, the cultural differences, the potential pitfalls, but sitting in his lifeless apartment with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator to keep him company, he thought, what do I really have to lose? The decision wasn't made overnight, but once it solidified in his mind, there was no turning back. He sold his car, packed up his belongings, and resigned from his job, shocking his boss, who had assumed he'd stay until retirement. The reactions were predictable. Some admired his courage, others thought he was insane. Maybe he was. The planning stage felt like the beginning of an adventure, a taste of the freedom he longed for. He calculated costs, researched visa requirements, and booked a one-way ticket. Manila would be his starting point, but Cebu seemed like a better long-term fit, big enough to have conveniences, small enough to avoid the madness of the capital. Standing at the airport, passport in hand, there was a flicker of doubt. Was he making a mistake? Would he regret this 6 months down the line? But the alternative, staying, working, dying slowly in a cubicle, felt like the bigger risk. As the plane lifted off, Michael watched the lights of his city shrink beneath him. This was it. No turning back now. The first thing that hit Michael when he stepped out of the airport in Manila was the heat. It was the kind of humidity that clung to the skin, thick and suffocating, making every breath feel heavy. He had read about it, had expected it, but no amount of preparation could compare to the actual experience. It was past midnight, but the city was alive. Horns blaring, people moving in every direction, the air filled with the mixed scent of gasoline, street food, and something he couldn't quite place. He had arranged a hotel for his first few nights, a mid-range place that was supposed to be comfortable. The taxi ride from the airport was an immediate lesson in chaos. Traffic laws, if they existed, seemed optional. Drivers weaved in and out of lanes, honking aggressively, motorcycles squeezing between vehicles with inches to spare. He gripped the door handle instinctively as his driver laughed, as if this kind of madness was just another day. When he arrived at the hotel, exhaustion hit him. The flight had been long, and the mixture of nerves and excitement had drained him. The check-in process was quick, and soon he was alone in his room, staring at the ceiling. It was a strange feeling, being thousands of miles from home, surrounded by a language he barely understood, realizing that this wasn't a vacation. This was his life now. The next morning he stepped out into the city, eager to explore. Manila was overwhelming. The sidewalks were uneven, packed with vendors selling everything from fruit to counterfeit electronics. The smells were intense: grilled meat, fried fish, exhaust fumes, and something sweet he couldn't identify. He felt eyes on him, curious, glances, some friendly, others calculating. Foreigners were common in certain areas, but in others they stood out. He wasn't sure if he liked the attention. He stopped at a cafe, ordering coffee from a menu he could barely read. The barista smiled, her English clear but accented, and he realized how much he took language for granted. Simple interactions that had once been effortless now required more thought. When she handed him his coffee, he hesitated before saying, "Salamat," one of the few Tagalog words he had memorized. Her face lit up with genuine appreciation, and for the first time since arriving, he felt a small sense of connection. As he wandered the streets, reality started setting in. Everything felt different. The way people interacted, the unspoken social rules, the pace of life, it wasn't bad, just unfamiliar. He had read about culture shock, had convinced himself that he was prepared, but nothing in his research had fully captured the feeling of being completely out of place. Then came the financial surprise. His initial assumption had been that the Philippines was cheap, and in many ways it was. But Manila was more expensive than expected, especially if he wanted a standard of living similar to what he was used to. He quickly realized that imported goods cost a fortune, and Western-style apartments in decent areas weren't as cheap as he had hoped. If he wasn't careful, his savings would drain faster than anticipated. The loneliness crept in faster than he had expected. Back home, he hadn't been the most social person, but at least there was familiarity. Here, he was a stranger. Conversations felt transactional, and while some locals were friendly, there was always a lingering question in the back of his mind. Were they genuinely interested in getting to know him, or was he just another foreigner with money? That night, he sat in his hotel room, scrolling through his phone, reading posts from other expats. Some had found happiness here, had built lives, families, businesses. Others had crashed and burned, returning home with empty bank accounts and bitter stories. Which one would he be? For the first time since making this decision, doubt started, creeping in. Maybe he had been naive. Maybe this wasn't the fresh start he had imagined. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling once again, he asked himself a question he wasn't sure he wanted the answer to. Had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? Michael woke up with a knot in his stomach. The excitement of the move had worn off, replaced by something heavier, uncertainty. He had left everything behind for this, and now, as he sat in his hotel room with his savings slowly dripping away, he realized he had no real plan beyond move to the Philippines and figure it out. He needed to take control. Sitting in his hotel room overthinking wasn't going to help. The first step was getting out of Manila. He had always intended to settle in Cebu, a place with beaches, a slower pace, and a growing expat community. Manila had been a stepping stone, but it was draining, too crowded, too fast, too expensive. He booked a flight, packed his bags, and within a few days he was landing in Cebu, hoping for a fresh start within his fresh start. Cebu was different. It still had traffic, still had noise, but there was something calmer about it. The people seemed friendlier, and the city, while developed, had a more manageable feel. He checked into a smaller, budget-friendly hotel and set out to find a longer-term place to live. He quickly learned that real estate listings online didn't always match reality. Apartments that looked modern and spacious in photos turned out to be cramped or poorly maintained. The ones that met his standards were pricier than expected. While searching for a place, he stumbled upon an expat bar near the city center. It was the kind of place where older Western men gathered, some retired, some running small businesses, others just existing. The atmosphere was casual, filled with stories of success, failure, and the kind of brutally honest advice that no guidebook would ever offer. One man, Greg, a 60-year-old from Texas who had been living in the Philippines for over a decade, took an immediate interest in Michael. "So you look lost," Greg said, sipping his beer. Michael let out a dry laugh. "That obvious?" Greg smirked. "Only to someone who's been in your shoes." They talked for hours. Greg had come to the Philippines with similar dreams, but had learned the hard way that paradise wasn't handed to you. It had to be built. He warned Michael about the common traps, trusting the wrong people, overspending, expecting things to work the way they did back home. He also gave him practical advice: where to find a good apartment, how to negotiate rent, which neighborhoods were safe, and most importantly, how to integrate instead of just existing as an outsider. "You didn't move here to be a tourist," Greg said, leaning in. "You came to live, So stop acting like a visitor. That conversation changed something in Michael. He had been treating this move like an extended vacation, waiting for things to fall into place. But life didn't work. Like that, not in the US, not here. Taking Greg's advice, he found a modest one-bedroom apartment just outside the main city area, away from the overpriced tourist spots. It wasn't luxurious, but it was comfortable, safe, and affordable. He started shopping at local markets instead of supermarkets filled with overpriced imported goods. He forced himself to learn basic Cebuano, even if it was just greetings and small talk. The reactions from locals were immediate. People appreciated the effort, even if his pronunciation was terrible. The financial situation still weighed on him. His savings were enough for now, but he needed a way to sustain himself. Teaching English online seemed like a viable option. It wasn't glamorous, but it was flexible, and could at least cover his rent and expenses. Within a few weeks, he had a routine, a small but important sense of stability. But the biggest challenge wasn't money or language. It was loneliness. He had made acquaintances, but no real connections. Nights were spent eating alone, walking alone, thinking alone. He had expected to feel free, but instead, he felt like a ghost, drifting through a life he hadn't yet claimed. Then came the question he had been avoiding. Why was he really here? Was it just about escaping America? About stretching his savings? Or was he searching for something deeper, connection, purpose, something that had been missing long before he ever set foot on Filipino soil? He had made progress, sure. But the real challenge wasn't adapting to the Philippines. It was figuring out who he was supposed to be in this new life. And for that, no expat guidebook had the answer. Michael sat on his small balcony, looking out at the narrow street below. The sounds of the city had become familiar. Motorcycles zipping past, the occasional vendor shouting, children laughing in the distance. He had settled into a routine, but something still felt off. He had avoided admitting it to himself, but the truth was becoming harder to ignore. He was lonely. His interactions with locals were polite but superficial. The expat crowd was a mixed bag, some genuinely interesting people, others bitter men, complaining about everything, from their ex-wives to the local government. He didn't want to become one of them. He had moved here for a fresh start, not to spend his days drinking in an expat bar, reliving the past. One evening, while eating, at a small carinderia, a local eatery where food was served in steaming trays, he overheard a conversation at the next table. A group of young Filipinos were laughing, teasing each other, switching seamlessly between Cebuano and English. Their energy was infectious. One of them, a woman in her early 30s, caught him looking. Instead of turning away, she smiled. "New here?" she asked. Michael hesitated for a second before nodding. "Yeah, still figuring things out." "Figuring out how to eat?" she teased, glancing at his plate. He had taken safe options, grilled chicken, rice, nothing too adventurous. He laughed. "I'm working my way up to the weird stuff." She introduced herself as Anna. Unlike many of the people he had met, she wasn't overly fascinated by the fact that he was American. She was friendly but not overly accommodating, asking him questions without tiptoeing around cultural differences. They talked for a while, and by the end of the meal, she invited him to join her group for drinks. It was a casual offer, no hidden agenda, just an open door. For the first time in months, Michael felt like he belonged somewhere. That night, he found himself sitting at a plastic table outside a small bar, surrounded by laughter, clinking glasses, and rapid-fire conversations. Anna and her friends welcomed him without making a big deal about it. No one expected him to pay for anything. No one treated him like a novelty. He was just another guy at the table. The conversations that night weren't about escaping life, but embracing it. They talked about work, music, travel, relationships, the real things that made up a life. Michael realized how much he had missed this. Not just being around people, but being part of something. Over the next few weeks, Anna became a constant presence in his life. She wasn't interested in dating him, and he respected that. She was simply a friend, someone who helped him see the Philippines through local eyes rather than an expat's filter. She introduced him to new places, new foods, new people. She taught him the nuances of Filipino culture that no guidebook could explain. How to read between the lines in conversations, how to avoid coming across as arrogant without realizing it, how to truly integrate rather than just exist. One night, as they walked through the city streets, Anna asked him a question that caught him off guard. "So what are you really looking for here?" He had an answer ready, the one he always gave about seeking a better life, about escaping the grind. But he didn't say it. Instead, he was honest. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought I did, but now I'm not so sure." Anna smiled. "That's good. Means you're actually paying attention now." Michael thought about that for a long time. Maybe he had spent too much time trying to force his life into a perfect plan, expecting everything to fall into place just because he had made a big move. Maybe real change wasn't about running away or starting over. It was about learning how to actually live, no matter where you were. That night, as he sat on his balcony, the city below buzzing with life, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Michael's life in the Philippines had taken a turn, but not in the way he had originally expected. He had stopped, chasing an idea of paradise, and had started actually living. His days had structure now, teaching English online in the mornings, exploring the city in the afternoons, and occasionally meeting up with Anna and her friends in the evenings. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt real. One afternoon, while sitting in a quiet cafe, he found himself reflecting on the person he had been back in the US. He had been a man of routine, someone who followed the same patterns day after day, expecting something to change without ever doing anything differently. Now everything was different, yet he still had moments where he felt like the same person. Could change really happen just because you moved to a new country? Or was it something deeper? His phone buzzed. It was Greg, the older expat who had given him advice when he first arrived in Cebu. "Come to the bar tonight," the message read. "Got someone I want you to meet." Michael hesitated. The expat bar scene wasn't really his thing anymore, but Greg had been good to him. He owed him that much. That evening he found himself back at the dimly lit bar, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of men swapping exaggerated stories. Greg was sitting at his usual spot, beer in hand, next to a Filipino man in his 40s. "Michael, meet Ramon," Greg said, motioning to the man. "Runs a small business here. Figured you two should talk." Michael shook Ramon's hand, curious. "What kind of business?" "Freelance work," Ramon said, his English smooth but accented. "Helping foreigners like you adjust. Paperwork, rentals, translations, that kind of thing. You'd be surprised how many guys move here with no idea what they're doing." Michael chuckled. "I believe it." Greg leaned in. "I told Ramon, you've been looking for something more stable than teaching online. Maybe you two can help each other out." The conversation flowed from there. Ramon wasn't offering a full-time job, just some part-time work helping newcomers navigate life in the Philippines. Michael had never considered himself a guide, but after his own rocky adjustment, he realized he had learned a lot. What to avoid, what to expect, what most foreigners got wrong. By the end of the night, he had agreed to help Ramon on a trial basis. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next few weeks were a blur. He started assisting with apartment searches, guiding newly arrived expats through the maze of local customs, and even helping with small translation tasks. Though his Cebuano was still rough, he knew enough to bridge gaps. It was a strange feeling, being the one giving advice instead of taking it. One day he found himself helping an older American man, freshly retired and wide-eyed with optimism. The man reminded him of himself just months ago, full of dreams, but completely unprepared. As Michael explained how to negotiate rent and avoid common scams, he realized something. He had changed. He wasn't the lost foreigner anymore. He wasn't just surviving here. He was building something. That night, sitting alone on his balcony, he let the thought sink in. He had come here looking for escape, but maybe what he had really found was purpose. Michael's work with Ramon was going better than expected. What had started as a side gig quickly turned into something more structured. The demand was there, foreigners arriving in Cebu, clueless about where to live, how to handle visas, or even how to open a bank account. Some were retirees looking for a peaceful life. Others were younger, digital nomads like him, trying to make their money last in a country where the cost of living was lower. He found satisfaction in it. There was something rewarding about helping people avoid the mistakes he had made. And the more he worked, the more he realized how many men arrived in the Philippines with expectations that didn't match reality. One afternoon he met with a new client, a man named Daniel from Chicago. Early 40s, divorced, looking for a fresh start. Michael could tell within minutes that Daniel had been sold on the fantasy, the idea that life here would be easy, that the Philippines was some kind of escape from all his problems back home. "So," Daniel said, sipping his beer, "what do the women think of American guys?" Michael had heard this question 100 times before. He leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "They think what anyone would think," he said. "Some are genuinely interested. Some see you as an opportunity. Some don't care about you at all." Daniel frowned. "I heard they love Westerners," Michael sighed. "Some do, but not for the reasons you might think." It was one of the biggest misconceptions foreigners had about the Philippines. Yes, there were women who sought out Western men, but it wasn't some universal truth. The reality was more complicated. Some women saw foreigners as stable, financially secure partners. Others had genuine relationships with them. And then there were those who had been burned before, by expats who came through, made promises and left. Michael had seen it happen. He had met guys who treated the Philippines like a playground, who hopped from one relationship to another, never considering the consequences. He had also met men who had found real love here, who had built families and lives they never could have had back home. "The question isn't what they think of you," Michael said, looking Daniel in the eye. "It's what you're really looking for." Daniel sat back, thoughtful. "I guess I just want something real." Michael nodded. "Then stop treating this place like a fantasy. Get to know people. Respect the culture. If you're genuine, you'll find someone who sees you for who you are, not just where you're from." Daniel was quiet for a while, then finally smiled. "You've been here too long, man. You sound like a local." Michael laughed. Maybe he wasn't a local, but he was no longer just another lost foreigner either. That night, as he walked through the streets of Cebu, he thought about his own expectations when he first arrived. He had come here looking for change, but what he had found was something better, understanding, of the country, of the people, and most importantly, of himself. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was searching anymore. He had finally arrived.